You're just the maid, Amara. Don't forget that." The words hit like cold glass shattering across marble. The silence that followed was sharper still, the kind that made every heartbeat echo. Amara Johnson stood frozen by the dining table, hands trembling around the silver tray she had been setting down. The afternoon light spilling through the tall windows painted gold across her brown skin, but nothing in that room felt warm anymore. Ethan Carrington's voice was smooth and low, the voice of a man who had built empires and crushed men twice his size in boardrooms. But right now, it cut. His jaw flexed, blue eyes icy and unyielding. He stood over her in a dark suit, the perfection of his posture contrasting with the scattered innocence of his two small children standing behind him. 6-year-old Liam's little face had gone pale. 4-year-old Sophie clutched her toy rabbit to her chest, her bottom lip trembling. Amara opened her mouth, but no sound came out. There was nothing to defend, only the ache of humiliation. Ethan had walked in on her helping Sophie bake cupcakes. The children had flour on their cheeks, laughter on their tongues, and music playing from Amara's phone. Nothing scandalous. But to a man whose world was run by strict order, by control and image, it looked like chaos. "You're paid to clean, not to play house," he said, eyes narrowing. "I don't want my children growing up thinking the help runs the home." Her throat ached, her palms sweaty against the tray. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carrington," she whispered. They were just enough. The word hit like a slap. She bowed her head slightly, as if that might hide the tears threatening to surface. "Yes, sir." He turned away sharply. "You're dismissed for the day." Liam's voice broke the tension, small, frightened. "But, Daddy, Miss Amara was just—" "Go to your room, Liam." The boy flinched and obeyed. Sophie followed, clutching Amara's skirt for one last moment before letting go. When they disappeared upstairs, Ethan finally exhaled, a sound almost like exhaustion, though he'd never admit it. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his reflection shimmering in the amber liquid. "Boundaries," he muttered, more to himself than her. "That's all I ask for." Amara nodded once. "Yes, sir." She left quietly. The echo of the front door closing lingered longer than any argument could. That evening, the mansion felt too quiet. Ethan sat in his study, surrounded by walls of books and the glow of his computer screens. But the usual rhythm, contracts, markets, numbers, refused to comfort him. The silence clawed at him instead. From down the hall, he heard Sophie's muffled cries. He closed his laptop and went to check on her. She was in her bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Miss Amara didn't say good night," she whispered through sniffles. "She'll be back tomorrow," Ethan said stiffly, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Did you make her cry?" Sophie asked softly. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "She cries sometimes when you yell," she said, half asleep, her voice fading. "You shouldn't be mean, Daddy. Miss Amara makes the house smell happy." Ethan sat there, frozen. He didn't know what to say. After she drifted to sleep, he lingered by her bedside, staring at the dim nightlight. His daughter's words settled deep in him, heavier than any business deal. "You shouldn't be mean, Daddy." The next morning, Amara returned quietly at her usual time. She wore a simple blue blouse tucked into a gray skirt, her curls tied neatly behind her head. There was a faint puffiness around her eyes, though she smiled gently when the children ran to greet her. Ethan watched from the balcony above as she knelt to hug them. For the first time, he noticed how tenderly she moved, how her presence seemed to calm the air itself. The house felt lighter the moment she stepped inside. He didn't understand why that unsettled him. When he descended the staircase, she immediately straightened and lowered her gaze. "Good morning, Mr. Carrington," he hesitated. "Morning." There was a pause, long enough for an apology, but none came. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks and walked past her, muttering something about a meeting downtown. Amara exhaled softly. She was used to silence. What she wasn't used to was the ache it left behind. By afternoon, she was in the children's playroom, humming softly while helping Liam with a drawing. "What are you making?" she asked. "It's you," Liam said proudly, holding up a crayon picture of a smiling woman surrounded by flowers and two small kids. She laughed. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." Sophie, sitting cross-legged nearby, added, "Daddy doesn't like flowers. He says they're messy." Amara smiled sadly. Sometimes messy things are the prettiest. Neither child noticed Ethan standing in the doorway. He had come home early, unannounced, to grab a file he'd forgotten. And there he was, watching again. Watching as Amara gently brushed Liam's hair from his forehead, guiding his hand as he colored. Watching Sophie nestle against her like she'd known her all her life. Something stirred in him. Confusion, guilt, a flicker of something dangerously close to admiration. He turned and left without saying a word. That night, in his vast bedroom overlooking the city skyline, Ethan lay awake long after midnight. The city below pulsed with lights, cars, life. The world he controlled. Yet his mind drifted back to that small, quiet playroom, to laughter, to warmth, to something he hadn't let himself feel in years. He didn't know it yet, but a crack had formed in the fortress of his heart. Small, invisible, but real. And through that crack, light had begun to seep in. The rain came down in sheets that morning, tapping softly against the glass walls of the Carrington estate. The mansion looked like a silver fortress under the storm, cold, vast, and silent. Inside, Ethan sat at the head of the breakfast table with his tablet propped against a crystal pitcher of orange juice. His children sat quietly across from him, spooning cereal while Amara moved around the kitchen, almost ghost-like in her silence. "Liam," Ethan said, eyes never leaving the screen. "You're wearing your sweater backward again." Liam flushed and began tugging at the fabric. Embarrassed, Amara gently knelt beside him. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, turning the sweater around with patient hands. "Happens to the best of us." Ethan looked up briefly, his expression unreadable. "You can let the nanny handle that," he said, tone clipped. "I am the nanny," she replied softly, though her voice carried a trace of hurt. He didn't answer. He wasn't trying to be cruel, not intentionally, but control was his comfort, and Amara's ease around the children unsettled the fragile order he clung to. Sophie giggled suddenly, spoon in midair. "Daddy, Miss Amara says you can't whistle." Ethan looked at her, startled. "Excuse me?" Liam grinned. "Yeah, she said you're too serious to whistle." Amara's eyes widened. "Oh, no, I didn't. I was just joking." But the damage was done. Ethan leaned back in his chair, expression blank. The air went still. "I see," he said finally, setting his tablet down. "I'm glad I'm providing so much entertainment." "Mr. Carrington, I didn't mean—" "It's fine," he said, but the edge in his tone betrayed him. "Finish breakfast. I'll be late for a meeting." He stood and left the table without another glance. The moment he disappeared, the children turned to Amara with worried faces. "Did Daddy get mad again?" Sophie whispered. Amara forced a smile, even as her stomach twisted. He's just busy, that's all. But when she went to load the dishwasher, her hands trembled. That afternoon, the housekeeper, Mrs. Bloom, a sharp-tongued older woman who had worked for the Carrington family since Ethan was a teenager, found Amara folding laundry in the servants' quarters. "You should be careful," Mrs. Bloom said, her voice low but cutting. "Mr. Carrington doesn't like staff who get too familiar with the children." Amara blinked, startled. They need affection. They miss their mother." Mrs. Bloom's eyes softened, just slightly. "We all miss her, dear. But this house runs on silence. You'd do well to remember that." Amara nodded, eyes dropping to the neat pile of folded clothes. "Yes, ma'am." But she couldn't stop the ache that rose in her chest. She remembered the day she first met Ethan, the cold handshake, the contract with too many clauses, the way his eyes never met hers for more than a second. She'd taken the job because she needed the money to support her younger brother's college fees back home in Georgia. But what she hadn't expected was to care. She hadn't meant to love the children. It had just happened. 2 days later, Ethan returned from work early. The rain had forced the markets to close early due to a power issue downtown. He stepped into his house expecting silence, as always. Instead, he heard laughter. The sound was coming from the living room. Soft music, high giggles, the hum of warmth that didn't belong in a house like his. He followed the sound and stopped in the doorway. Amara was on the floor, surrounded by a blanket fort made from couch cushions and bed sheets. Sophie sat on her lap, pretending to read a storybook, while Liam was wearing one of Ethan's ties like a superhero cape. Fairy lights flickered above them, turning the marble space into a small universe of joy. Ethan's heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. "Miss Amara," he said quietly. The laughter froze. The children turned, eyes wide. Amara quickly stood, smoothing her skirt. "Mr. Carrington, the children wanted—" "What is all this?" His voice wasn't angry, but it carried that familiar steel. "Just playtime," she said softly. They were restless. He looked around at the scattered toys, the glowing lights, the way the children clung to her like she was the only safety they knew. "This isn't a daycare," he said coldly. Liam stepped forward, small fists balled. "Don't be mean to her." Ethan's eyes flicked to his son, startled. "She's nice," Sophie added, voice trembling. "We love her." The words hung heavy in the air. For a long moment, Ethan didn't know how to respond. His throat felt tight, his mind blank. He had built an empire on control. But nothing about this moment could be contained or reasoned away. He turned and walked out without a word. That night, he poured himself another glass of whiskey in the dim quiet of his study. Rain still fell outside, streaking the glass walls like tears. He stared at his reflection. The perfect suit, the perfect face, the perfect emptiness. He thought of Amara's face when he'd entered the living room. The flash of fear, the quick apology, the strength it took for her not to cry. He thought of his children's words. "We love her." He swallowed hard, set his glass down, and whispered to no one. Maybe that's the problem. But deep down, something inside him, something long buried, stirred. Not just guilt, not just regret, but something warmer, something dangerous. Because for the first time in years, Ethan Carrington felt the faint pull of feeling, and that frightened him more than anything. The morning after the rain, the Carrington estate gleamed like polished silver beneath the returning sun. Dewdrops sparkled across the garden hedges, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth. But inside the mansion, The atmosphere remained heavy, as if the storm had never truly left. Amara moved through the hallways with quiet grace, her hair pulled back into a low braid. She smiled for the children's sake, humming softly as she packed their school bags. But the words from yesterday, Ethan's cold dismissal, the children's frightened faces, played over and over in her mind. She wasn't angry, just tired. "Liam, sweetheart, your art project," she reminded gently, slipping a folder into his backpack. "Thanks, Miss Amara," he chirped. "Will you be there when I get home?" "Of course," she smiled, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her eyes. Ethan appeared at the foot of the staircase just then, immaculate as ever. Charcoal suit, silk tie, watch gleaming. The smell of his cologne, sandalwood and control, followed him into the room. "Car's ready," he said curtly. "Let's not be late." "Yes, sir," Amara replied softly. Sophie tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, can Miss Amara come with us today?" He froze, adjusting his tie. "No, sweetheart. She has work to do here." Sophie frowned. "But she always helps with my shoes." Ethan hesitated. For a fraction of a second, his hardened features softened. Just a flicker. Then he crouched down, carefully tying the tiny white laces on his daughter's shoes himself. "There," he said, forcing a smile. "All done?" Sophie blinked. "You tied them wrong," Liam giggled. Amara covered her mouth to hide a laugh, and for the briefest instant, something unspoken passed between her and Ethan. Amusement, warmth, maybe even mutual embarrassment. But just as quickly, it was gone. "Let's go," he said, standing tall again. When the door shut behind them, Amara leaned against the wall and exhaled. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Bloom approached her again, whispering in her usual stern tone, "Word of advice, dear. Mr. Carrington's been unsettled lately. You should tread lightly. He's particular about boundaries." Amara looked up from the dishes. "I'm not trying to cross any, Mrs. Bloom." The older woman sighed, softening. "I know. But men like him, they don't see kindness the way we do." "To them, it looks like intrusion," Amara swallowed. "Then maybe the world needs to change how it sees kindness." Mrs. Bloom's eyes softened for a moment before she walked away. By the time Ethan returned that evening, he was exhausted. The day had been long, arguments in meetings, endless calls, his face plastered across a business magazine. Success had never felt more suffocating. He stepped inside to find the faint smell of cinnamon and music playing softly. A piano tune drifting from the family room. Curious, he followed the sound. There he found something that stopped him cold. Amara was sitting at the piano with Sophie on her lap, Liam beside her, all three singing softly to an old gospel tune. The melody was warm, low, rich. It filled the empty house like sunlight. "Miss Amara," Liam grinned when he noticed him, "we're teaching Daddy's piano how to smile." Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, one hand still on the doorframe. Sophie giggled. "Come sing with us, Daddy." He shook his head faintly, voice quieter than he intended. "I don't sing." Amara turned, her amber eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them this time, only a calm, steady kindness. "Everyone can sing," she said softly. Some just forgot how. It hit him harder than he expected. He didn't respond, just turned and walked away again. But he didn't go far. He lingered in the hallway, listening as her voice continued. Low, pure, tender. It had been years since he'd heard that sound in his home. That night, Amara sat on the small bench behind the servants' quarters, looking out at the moonlit garden. She took out her phone and called her younger brother back in Georgia. "Hey, Malik," she said softly. "Hey, sis, how's the big city treating you?" Amara smiled faintly. "It's different. Beautiful sometimes, cold sometimes," he laughed. "Sounds like New York. You still thinking about finishing school next year?" Her eyes clouded for a moment. "If I can save enough, the pay's steady, but—" She trailed off when she heard footsteps. Ethan stood a few feet away, dressed casually for once. Just a white shirt and slacks. He looked almost human like this, less like the billionaire everyone feared. "Sorry," he said, voice gentler than usual. "I didn't mean to interrupt." She quickly ended the call. "It's fine, sir. I wanted to thank you," he said suddenly. She blinked. "For what?" "For the music earlier. The kids haven't smiled like that in a long time." Her eyes softened. "They just needed a little music, that's all." He nodded, hands in his pockets. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "My wife. She used to sing around the house. The kids were so little when she passed. Sometimes I think they forgot what joy sounds like." Amara's throat tightened. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carrington." He nodded again, his jaw tense, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond her. "I wasn't kind to you the other day." The confession hung between them, raw, unexpected. "It's all right," she said softly. "You've got a lot to carry." His gaze met hers, and something flickered there. Something unsure, something human. "Good night, Amara," he murmured. "Good night, sir." He walked away into the shadows of the hall, his heart heavier than before. But for the first time in years, the weight felt real. Upstairs, Liam stirred in his sleep, mumbling his nanny's name. Sophie rolled over, clutching her toy rabbit, and somewhere deep inside the mansion's marble silence, a fragile warmth had begun to take root, a tiny, impossible spark of life. The morning sun painted long gold streaks across the polished marble floors, slipping through the towering glass windows like light through water. The Carrington mansion looked peaceful, but beneath the surface, tension rippled quietly. Waiting, Ethan Carrington had woken earlier than usual. Restless, he stood on the balcony of his study, hands in his pockets, staring down at the gardens where his late wife used to plant white tulips every spring. For years, he'd kept them tended by landscapers, never by hand. It was easier to pay people to preserve beauty than to touch it himself. But today, something in him wanted to go down there, to see for himself. He didn't. Instead, he turned back inside, his reflection cold in the window. He had meetings, obligations, and an image to maintain. Yet no matter how he tried to slip back into the armor of his world, his thoughts kept circling back. To her, Amara. Downstairs, Amara was sweeping the foyer when she heard Sophie's laughter echo through the hall. "Miss Amara, Daddy said you can come to the park with us today." Amara blinked, surprised. "He said that?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, curls bouncing. "Yes, he said you could come instead of the driver because you make better sandwiches." Amara's lips parted in shock. "Oh, I see." Liam ran up beside his sister, waving his tiny backpack. "Hurry, Miss Amara. We're gonna miss the ducks." Amara's heart swelled despite her caution. "All right," she smiled. "Let me get my sweater." When she stepped outside a few minutes later, Ethan was already by the car, adjusting his cufflinks. He glanced at her briefly. No smirk, No scolding, just a nod. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes, sir." The drive was quiet, save for the soft hum of music on the radio. Sophie sang along in the back seat, her voice high and pure. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, but he caught the sound of Amara's quiet laughter when the little girl forgot the lyrics. It was disarming. Central Park was alive that morning. Sunlight filtering through branches, joggers passing, vendors selling hot dogs and balloons. The children ran ahead, chasing pigeons, their laughter ringing across the grass. Ethan stood a few steps back, hands in his pockets, watching as Amara knelt in the grass, showing Sophie how to braid flower stems together. Liam was beside them, holding a stick like a sword. "You're supposed to be the dragon," he told Amara. She gasped dramatically. "A dragon? Me?" "Yeah," he said, grinning. "And Daddy's the knight." Ethan chuckled quietly before he could stop himself. "The knight? I don't think I've earned that title." Amara looked up at him, smiling faintly. "Maybe you just haven't had the right battle yet." Their eyes met, sunlight flickering in her deep amber gaze. For a long second, neither of them moved. Then Sophie squealed, breaking the spell. "Daddy, the dragon's gonna eat us." Ethan laughed, a sound that startled even him. "Not if the knight can help it." And just like that, the man who hadn't smiled in years found himself running barefoot in the grass, pretending to fight an imaginary dragon, his children shrieking with joy. Amara laughed so hard she nearly fell over. It was a sight she never thought she'd see. Ethan Carrington, the billionaire tycoon, chasing imaginary monsters for his kids. When they finally collapsed onto the blanket in laughter and exhaustion, something wordless passed between them. Gratitude, admiration, maybe something deeper. Hours later, they returned to the mansion. The children napped upstairs, sunlight slanting through the curtains. Amara stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out the picnic containers, when Ethan's reflection appeared in the window beside her. "They haven't laughed like that since," he trailed off. "Since their mother?" she said softly. He nodded, jaw tight. "She used to do that. Take them out every weekend. When she died, I thought, if I just worked harder, if I just earned more, maybe the emptiness would quiet down." Amara turned, drying her hands on a towel. "But it doesn't." He met her gaze. Really met it this time. "No, it doesn't." The air between them thickened. She could feel the raw honesty in his tone, the kind that stripped a man of his wealth and power, leaving only the truth. "You're good with them," he said after a pause. "Better than I am." Her brows furrowed slightly. "You're their father." "That's enough," he shook his head. "You don't understand. I don't know how to be one. I keep thinking if I can just control everything, I'll protect them. But all I've done is build a cage." Amara hesitated, then stepped a little closer. "You can't protect children from life, Mr. Carrington, but you can walk beside them through it. That's what they need." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. His eyes softened, tracing her face, the small freckles across her nose, the calm strength in her gaze, the quiet compassion that made the air itself seem lighter. Then, too quickly, he stepped back. "Thank you, Amara. That'll be all for today." The wall was back up. "Yes, sir," she whispered. He walked out, but his heart wasn't untouched. That night, Amara lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small servant's room. She shouldn't feel this way. Not for her employer. Not for a man who'd once humiliated her in front of his children. And yet, the man she'd seen today wasn't the same one who'd stood in judgment weeks ago. There was something fractured in him, something worth saving. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his dim study, staring at a photo of his late wife, Elena, smiling in a garden, tulips in her arms. And for the first time since she died, he didn't cry for her. He thought of Amara, the way her laughter sounded like forgiveness, the way his children glowed in her presence. And for the first time in years, Ethan Carrington felt something he couldn't measure or control. He was falling, and he didn't know how to stop. The next morning arrived soft and golden, with light streaming through the tall windows and the faint chirping of birds outside. But inside the Carrington mansion, a different kind of storm was quietly brewing. Ethan Carrington was standing in his office, straight-backed and tense, staring down at an open invitation on his desk. The Carrington Foundation Charity Gala, a yearly event, attended by New York's most influential figures, investors, and socialites. The press would be there, the cameras, the same elite circle that had made him, and could just as easily destroy him. He'd hosted it for 6 years now, always immaculate, always composed, but this year felt different. Because this year, he couldn't stop thinking of how the mansion looked when Amara was in it, filled with laughter instead of formality, how she brought light into rooms he'd left dark. And somehow, the thought of that light meeting his world of cold marble and sharp suits terrified him. Amara spent the morning in the playroom with the children, unaware of the unease unraveling upstairs. Liam was building towers out of blocks. Sophie was painting her rabbit's ears pink, and Amara, with a soft smile, was sitting between them, her curls pulled into a loose bun. The sound of Ethan's footsteps came before his voice. "Amara, may I have a word?" She turned, startled. He never came to the playroom. "Yes, Mr. Carrington?" she said, quickly standing. He looked uneasy. Something rare for him. "I have a charity event tonight. The children will need supervision here." "Of course," she replied gently. He hesitated. "Actually, I'd like them to come. It might be good for them to see their friends again. But I'll need someone to help watch them at the venue." Amara blinked. "You want me to go?" "If you're comfortable," he said quietly. "You're the only one they trust." Her heart skipped. "Yes, sir. I'll be there." That evening, the grand ballroom of the Manhattan Hilton shimmered with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and the soft hum of polite laughter. Waiters floated through the crowd with champagne flutes, while photographers clicked away at the city's most powerful. Ethan stood near the entrance in a black tuxedo, looking every bit the image of untouchable grace. But his eyes kept drifting toward the doors. When Amara finally appeared, leading Liam and Sophie by the hand, he almost forgot to breathe. She wore a simple ivory dress, modest, elegant, with her curls loosely framing her face. No jewels, no designer brands, yet she outshone every woman in the room. For a moment, Ethan just stared. She noticed, cheeks warming. "Is everything all right, sir?" He blinked, pulling himself together. "Yes, you look appropriate," she smiled faintly. "Thank you." As the evening went on, Ethan mingled among donors, his charm polished to perfection. But every time he glanced toward the corner where Amara sat with the children, reading them a story to keep them calm among the noise and luxury, he felt something twist in his chest, and it didn't go unnoticed. "Who's that?" whispered Victoria Langford, one of the city's most infamous socialites, tall, blonde, and as venomous as she was beautiful. She stepped beside him, her smile sharp. "She doesn't exactly look like she belongs here." Ethan's jaw tightened. "She works for me." "Ah." Victoria said with a knowing smirk. A maid, then? My, you always did have peculiar tastes. He turned to her, his tone cool. Watch your words, Victoria. Oh, relax, she said, swirling her drink. We're all friends here, just surprised, that's all. You bring her here in that dress and expect people not to talk? Across the room, a few of the other guests were already whispering. He could see it, the sideways glances, the polite smiles, the smug curiosity. And when Amara stood to take Sophie to the restroom, one of the women nearby, a senator's wife, muttered loudly, Well, she certainly doesn't know her place. Amara froze mid-step, her face flushed, but she said nothing, just kept walking, Sophie's small hand gripping hers. Ethan saw it all, and something inside him snapped. When she returned, Amara tried to keep her composure, but her eyes glistened as she knelt to straighten Liam's collar. She didn't look at Ethan, not until his voice broke through the chatter of the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, stepping onto the stage, may I have your attention, please? The crowd fell silent. This foundation, he began, was created to honor my late wife, Elena, who believed compassion was not charity, but responsibility. She once told me that true generosity isn't about writing checks. It's about seeing people, every person. He looked straight at Amara. And tonight, he continued, voice tightening, I realize I've failed to do that myself. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Ethan took a breath. That woman over there, Amara Johnson, has been called a maid, a helper, even dismissed by me in my own home. But the truth is, she's the reason my children learned to laugh again. She's the reason my house feels alive. She's not just staff, she's family. The room was utterly still. Amara stood frozen, eyes wide, her hands trembling slightly as Sophie clung to her leg. Victoria's smirk vanished. Ethan's voice broke slightly as he added, I used to think power meant control. But tonight, I understand that real strength is humility, the courage to admit you were wrong. And I was, deeply. The crowd burst into applause. Hesitant at first, then wholehearted, Ethan stepped down from the stage, walking toward Amara. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for every word I said that made you feel small. You've done more for my family than I ever could. Tears glimmered in her eyes. Mr. Carrington, Ethan, he said softly. Please, just Ethan. She stared at him. The man who had once towered over her in judgment, now standing before her in front of the city's elite, stripped of pride, his voice trembling with sincerity. It was the kind of apology no one could fake. And in that moment, every barrier between them, class, color, pride, pain, began to crumble. That night, after the guests had gone, Amara helped Liam and Sophie fall asleep in the back seat of the limousine. Ethan sat across from her, the city lights flickering over his face. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. Yes, he murmured. I did. They sat in silence for a while, two worlds that never should have met, quietly realizing they no longer wanted to part. When their eyes met, something fragile yet unbreakable formed between them. Something that would change everything. The next few weeks felt different, not just in the Carrington mansion, but in every quiet rhythm of life within its walls. The tension that once clung to the air had vanished, replaced by something softer, warmer. The staff no longer scurried past Ethan in silence. He greeted them now, not out of duty, but respect. He'd become gentler, though the steel in him still glimmered beneath. And at the center of it all was Amara. Every morning, he found himself listening for her voice, that soft, melodic hum she carried while folding laundry or guiding the children through breakfast. She didn't avoid him anymore, but she didn't linger either. There was a distance, careful, polite, like she was waiting for him to prove that his apology hadn't been a momentary burst of guilt. It was a Saturday afternoon when Ethan decided to close that distance. He found her in the garden, kneeling beside Sophie as they planted tulip bulbs along the fence. The late autumn sun painted their skin in gold, the smell of damp earth rising between them. Ethan paused for a long moment before speaking. "They look happy," he said quietly. Amara turned, startled, wiping dirt from her hands. "Oh, Mr. Carrington, I didn't hear you," he smiled faintly. "You never do." "That's one of your powers," she laughed softly, but there was a hint of tension in her shoulders. "The children needed fresh air. It helps them feel grounded," he nodded, stepping closer. "You do that for them every day." Her eyes met his briefly before darting away. "It's just my job." "No," he said gently. "It's who you are." There was silence. Only the sound of Sophie's giggle and the scrape of small hands digging at the soil. Ethan crouched beside Amara, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender on her skin. "You could do so much more than this, you know," he said quietly. "Teach, write, work with children professionally. You have a gift?" Her hands stilled. "Maybe once," she whispered. Before what?" he asked. Amara's gaze dropped to the dirt. "Before life taught me to lower my eyes." He felt that sentence like a blow. "Amara," he said softly, "look at me." She hesitated, then lifted her head. The sunlight caught her eyes, deep brown, layered with sadness and quiet resilience. "You don't have to keep lowering them anymore," Ethan said, voice low. "Not here, not ever again." Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to reply, but the words never came. Instead, Sophie ran up, waving a small worm in her palm, and the moment dissolved into laughter. Still, something unspoken had been planted between them that day, something that, like the tulips, would one day bloom, but peace never stays unchallenged. 2 nights later, the story broke online. It started with a blurry photo. Ethan on stage at the charity gala, his gaze fixed tenderly on Amara. The caption read, "Billionaire Ethan Carrington defends his maid in emotional speech. Love across class lines?" Within hours, gossip sites exploded. Carrington's new scandal. Is the billionaire in love with his nanny? Mansion affair or misunderstood friendship? Ethan's phone wouldn't stop ringing. His board members wanted statements. His PR team demanded denials. But Ethan didn't care about any of that. What terrified him was what it would do to her. When he found Amara in the kitchen that morning, she was standing still, her phone on the counter, eyes glistening with humiliation. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, voice trembling. "I didn't want people talking about me like that." "I know," he said, moving closer. "And it's my fault," she shook her head. "It's not just the whispers. It's how they'll look at me now. Like I'm chasing you, like I did something wrong." "You didn't," he said firmly. "They did." But she turned away, gripping the counter, her body shaking. "You don't understand, Ethan. You can walk through that fire and still come out clean." "I can't. People like me don't get forgiven." He froze, realizing how true that was. Then, Without a word, she untied her apron. "I think I should leave," she said quietly. "Amara." "Please," she whispered, "don't make this harder." And before he could speak again, she walked out of the mansion, the sound of the door closing behind her, echoing like the final strike of a gavel. The following days were empty. Liam and Sophie cried every night. The house returned to its former silence, the kind that felt heavier now that they'd known what warmth was. Ethan tried to focus on work, but he couldn't concentrate. Her absence was everywhere. In the untouched tea mugs, the quiet hallways, the faint smell of lavender that lingered in the laundry room. He'd lost her, not because he mistreated her, but because he hadn't protected her from his world. And that realization burned. By the end of the week, the whispers in the press had only grown crueler. But for the first time, Ethan didn't hide from them. He called his lawyer, then his PR team, then a journalist, one who'd written a particularly scathing column about the billionaire and the maid. When they met for an interview 2 days later, he looked directly into the camera and said the words that made headlines across the country. "Her name is Amara Johnson. She's not my maid. She's my friend. She saved my children. She saved me, and I won't let anyone ever twist that into shame." The journalist blinked. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying," Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but fierce, "that if decency looks like scandal, then maybe the scandal is this society, not her." By nightfall, social media had turned. The same world that mocked Amara was now defending her. The story wasn't Billionaire and the Maid anymore. It was the woman who made a billionaire human. And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment filled with potted plants and half-read books, Amara saw the video. Her breath caught. For the first time, she saw Ethan not as her employer, not as a man trapped by privilege, but as someone who had finally learned to fight for her instead of above her. Tears slid down her cheeks as she whispered, "What have you done, Ethan?" But deep down, she already knew the answer. He had chosen her, not in silence, not in secrecy, but in truth. The following morning broke calm and pale, with a soft mist hanging over the city skyline. It was the kind of morning that seemed to hold its breath, waiting. At the Carrington mansion, the world had slowed to a hush. The children were still asleep. The staff whispered as they worked, and Ethan stood alone on the balcony, staring at the faint light bleeding over Manhattan. He hadn't slept in 2 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, Amara, standing in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she told him she had to leave. He'd replayed that moment endlessly, the way her voice cracked, the hurt she tried to hide. He'd thought power meant control. Now he knew power meant loss. The ache of realizing there was nothing you could buy, nothing you could command, to bring someone like her back. But he was done waiting. That afternoon, he left the mansion. No chauffeur, no guards, no entourage. Just Ethan Carrington. The man, not the billionaire, walking the cracked sidewalks of a quieter part of Brooklyn, holding an address scribbled on a small piece of paper. When he reached the building, a modest brick apartment with hanging laundry and potted plants on the windowsill, he hesitated for the first time in years. Then he knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened. Amara stood there barefoot, wearing a simple gray sweater and soft blue jeans. Her curls were loose, her eyes tired, but still as gentle as ever. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she said softly, "Ethan, what are you doing here?" He took a breath. "I came to bring you home." Her face changed, a flicker of longing, then restraint. "You can't just fix this by showing up." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm not here to fix it. I'm here to tell you something I should have said long ago." He stepped closer, his voice low and raw. "You changed me, Amara. You showed me that kindness isn't weakness. That love doesn't care about class or color or the walls people build around their hearts. You made me see the man I was and the man I still can be." Her breath trembled. "Ethan, don't say that." "People already—" "I don't care what people say." His tone sharpened, but not with arrogance, with conviction. "Let them talk. Let them twist it. I'm done living a life that looks perfect, but feels hollow. You once told me you learned to lower your eyes because life taught you to. I'm asking you now, look up, just once." "At me?" Tears filled her eyes. "Ethan." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is the letter I sent to the foundation board this morning. I resigned." Her eyes widened. "You what?" "I'll still fund the charity, but I'm not running it anymore. Not while the people in that circle believe their worth is measured by who they stand above." He handed her the letter, his voice steady. "I'm starting something new. A program for single mothers, underpaid caretakers, and domestic workers, with full scholarships for their children. And I want you to help lead it." She stared at him, disbelief mingling with awe. "Me? Who better?" he said softly. "You understand what they face. You've lived it. You're the one who can make it real." Her hand covered her mouth as a tear slipped down her cheek. "Ethan, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he whispered. The silence between them stretched, heavy, trembling. Then, with a quiet exhale, she said, "Yes." 2 weeks later, the city gathered again. Not in a ballroom, but in a community center filled with bright murals and laughter. A banner hung over the entrance. "The Johnson Carrington Foundation for Caregivers." Reporters came. Cameras flashed, but this time, Ethan didn't stand in the center of the stage. Amara did. She looked radiant in a soft white dress, her curls glowing beneath the stage lights. Her hands shook slightly as she approached the microphone. "2 months ago," she began, "I was a housemaid, working quietly in a home that didn't feel like mine. I never imagined I'd be standing here today, speaking to you, not as someone's employee, but as someone who finally found her voice." She glanced toward Ethan, who stood at the back of the stage, watching her with pride. "I used to believe that people like me were invisible," she continued, "that no one saw us beyond the tasks we did. But someone did. Someone saw me not as a maid, but as a person. And because of that, I learned to see myself again." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "This foundation is for every woman and man who ever thought they didn't matter. For every child who watched their parent work 2 jobs and still smile. You matter. You are seen." The applause that followed was thunderous. But the most powerful moment came after, when Amara stepped off the stage and Ethan met her halfway. "Proud doesn't begin to cover it," he said softly. She smiled through tears. "You didn't have to give me your name in that title." "I did," he replied, "because you gave mine its meaning." As the crowd dispersed and the evening softened into gold, Ethan and Amara stood outside, watching the sun dip behind the skyline. The air smelled faintly of rain and promise. Sophie and Liam came running up, their laughter echoing through the courtyard. "Miss Amara! Daddy! Come see the mural!" They followed the children to the far wall, where a newly painted mural stretched across the bricks. A garden of tulips blooming beneath the words, "Kindness changes everything." Amara's hand brushed Ethan's. For a moment, neither pulled away. He turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever regret it? Coming into that house?" She shook her head, smiling softly. "No, because sometimes you have to walk through someone else's world to teach them how to live in yours." He smiled, the kind of smile that carried peace. "Then I guess we both learned." She nodded, her eyes glistening in the last light of dusk. "We did." And as the sun disappeared behind the skyline, Ethan reached for her hand, not as a billionaire claiming what he wanted, but as a man humbly asking for what he hoped he'd earned. She didn't hesitate. Their fingers intertwined. Quiet, steady, certain. In that single gesture, two worlds that had never been meant to meet finally found their place together. Epilogue months later. The mansion was alive again. Laughter spilling from the halls, music drifting from open windows. The garden bloomed with the tulips Amara and Sophie had planted months before. Ethan stood at the kitchen doorway, watching Amara read to the children, her voice warm and full of life. When she caught him staring, she smiled. "You're supposed to be helping, not just watching." "I am helping," he said, smirking. "By appreciating great storytelling." She rolled her eyes, laughing. "You're impossible." "Maybe," he said softly, walking closer. "But I'm home." And she looked up at him, that same quiet grace in her eyes, and whispered, "So am I." The house was no longer silent, nor divided by wealth or walls. It was filled with something richer, something no fortune could ever buy. Love.